The Return of Great Powers. This video is based on key insights from the book The Return of Great Powers by Jim Sciutto. Chapter 1: Great Power Warfare. Jim Sciutto opens his account with a startling wake-up call, a late-night phone call from a member of Congress, warning him about an impending, larger-than-expected attack on Kyiv. This sets the stage for a detailed look at the early days of the war in Ukraine and the surprising miscalculations made by Western intelligence agencies. While they correctly predicted the invasion, they vastly underestimated Ukraine's ability to resist and Russia's military shortcomings. Sciutto recounts being stationed with other news teams at the Intercontinental Hotel in Kyiv, a strategically located but vulnerable position, and the attempts to communicate their presence to Russian authorities, a precaution that proved somewhat futile given Russia's imprecise targeting. The chapter quickly moves beyond the immediate events of February 2022 to examine the broader implications of the conflict as a turning point in global power dynamics. Sciutto highlights the initial skepticism surrounding the warnings of an invasion, fueled by past intelligence failures and a reluctance to believe Russia would launch a full-scale war. He details the doubts even within Ukraine itself, where President Zelensky feared being used as a pawn in a geopolitical game between the US and Russia. Despite these doubts, US intelligence had access to crucial information, including intercepted Russian communications, revealing detailed invasion plans. Sciutto emphasizes that the war in Ukraine isn't just a regional conflict. It's a clean break from the post-Cold War era and a return to great power competition. He points out that the initial phase of the war, the attempted shock and awe campaign against Kyiv, mirrored the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, but with a dramatically different outcome. While the US anticipated a swift victory, Russia's advance stalled due to fierce Ukrainian resistance and surprisingly effective tactics. The use of Javelin anti-tank missiles by Ukrainian soldiers, widely documented on social media, became a symbol of their successful defense. The author details Ukraine's unexpected counteroffensives in the south and northeast in late 2022, which caught Russia off guard and resulted in significant territorial gains for Ukraine. He notes that US intelligence initially underestimated Ukraine's capabilities and urged caution, but Ukrainian commanders pressed forward, achieving remarkable success. The rapid retreat of Russian forces from Kharkiv, leaving behind vast amounts of equipment, was a particularly striking example of Ukraine's military prowess. Sciutto explains that this success wasn't just luck. It was a result of Ukraine's smaller, more mobile, and highly trained units effectively utilizing modern weaponry. However, the chapter doesn't shy away from the challenges Ukraine faced in its second counteroffensive in 2023. Sciutto reports that the offensive was slower and less successful than anticipated, hampered by heavily fortified Russian defenses and Russia's adaptation to Ukrainian tactics. He details the difficulties Ukrainian forces encountered breaching Russian minefields and facing more effective Russian air defenses. This phase of the war highlighted the importance of both modern technology and traditional warfare. With trench warfare and artillery duels reminiscent of World War I alongside the use of drones and advanced weaponry. Sciutto then turns to the broader implications of the war for the future of great power conflict. He emphasizes that the conflict has exposed weaknesses in Western military supply chains, which were geared towards smaller-scale conflicts rather than a large-scale conventional war. He uses the analogy of the Amazon model, just-in-time delivery with limited stockpiles, to illustrate the need for increased defense production and preparedness. The shortage of 155mm artillery shells, forcing the US to resort to controversial cluster munitions, is a prime example of this issue. The author's interviews with military leaders, including General Mark Milley, reveal a consistent theme: the historical dangers of conflict between a rising power and a status quo power. Milley stresses the importance of maintaining a rules-based international order to prevent great power war. warning that the current weakening of that order is a cause for concern. Sciutto also highlights the lessons learned about the importance of adaptability and initiative on the battlefield, contrasting the Ukrainian forces' decentralized command structure with the more rigid Russian approach. Throughout the chapter, Sciutto subtly introduces the looming shadow of China. While the focus is primarily on Russia and Ukraine, the lessons learned from the conflict, the importance of military preparedness, the effectiveness of modern weaponry, and the dangers of underestimating an adversary are directly relevant to potential conflicts involving China, particularly regarding Taiwan. The author suggests that China is closely observing the war in Ukraine, learning from both Russia's mistakes and Ukraine's successes. The chapter concludes with a sense of unease, acknowledging that the war in Ukraine has ushered in a new era of great power competition and that the risk of wider conflict remains very real. Chapter 2: Dividing Lines. Jim Sciutto details a world rapidly dividing into distinct camps, with Russia and China increasingly aligned against the West, and the potential for a much larger conflict growing. The chapter opens with the June 2022 NATO summit in Madrid, where leaders sensed a real danger of war spreading beyond Ukraine. They realized simply warning Russia wasn't enough. NATO needed to show strength with more troops and weapons, a clear signal to President Putin. Sciutto notes a shift in thinking earlier. Many doubted Putin would actually invade Ukraine, even with troops massing at the border. But the invasion happened, forcing a reckoning about the possibility of a wider war. A key concern Sciutto highlights is the emergence of three spheres of influence, one for the West, one for Russia, and one for China. He illustrates this with a visual idea. Imagine two lines forming a V shape across the globe. One line separates Russia and NATO, running from Finland to Turkey. The other separates China and Russia from the US and its allies, stretching from the Arctic to the South China Sea. These lines aren't just on a map. They represent areas where tensions are high and conflicts could erupt. Sciutto points to several hotspots: Ukraine, Taiwan, the Baltic states, the South China Sea, and even the Arctic, where all major powers are competing. Sciutto explains that Russia's invasion of Ukraine unexpectedly strengthened NATO. Instead of dividing the alliance, it united members in support of Ukraine and prompted Finland and Sweden, traditionally neutral countries, to seek membership. This dramatically expands NATO's border with Russia, forcing Moscow to adjust its military strategy. The author emphasizes that Putin miscalculated, believing the West would be weak and divided. Instead, he faced a united front that has imposed economic sanctions and provided Ukraine with increasingly powerful weapons, like HIMARS and F-16s. The chapter then turns to China, identifying it as a second major strategic adversary for NATO. Sciutto details how NATO's updated, strategic concept document now explicitly names China as a challenge to its security, recognizing Beijing's growing global influence and its partnership with Russia. This marks a significant shift, as NATO was originally formed to counter the Soviet Union in Europe. Now, it's preparing for a world with two major rivals spanning the globe. Sciutto describes the no-limits partnership between Russia and China, highlighting the shared worldview of Presidents Putin and Xi Jinping. Both leaders believe the West is trying to contain their countries and undermine their power. They see a need for a new world order that challenges U.S. dominance. The author recounts the symbolic meeting between Putin and Xi in Moscow in March 2023, where they reaffirmed their commitment to a multipolar world and criticized the U.S.-led international system. This meeting signaled a deepening alliance, even as China hesitated to provide Russia with significant military aid for the war in Ukraine. Sciutto also points out that both Russia and China have internal weaknesses. Russia's military has been significantly weakened by the war in Ukraine, and its economy is struggling. China faces economic challenges, an aging population, and growing internal dissent. However, he cautions that these weaknesses might make both countries more dangerous, as their leaders feel pressure to act decisively. He references intelligence assessments suggesting China is accelerating its military buildup, aiming to have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. The author notes that many countries are trying to navigate this new world order by balancing relationships with both the West and Russia-China. He uses the term non-monogamous to describe this approach, where countries don't want to be fully aligned with one side. Sciutto details growing military cooperation between Russia and Iran, with Iran providing drones to Russia and potentially receiving advanced technology in return. He also mentions the new AUKUS security pact between the US, UK, and Australia, which aims to counter China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific region by providing Australia with nuclear submarines. Sciutto concludes by emphasizing the increasing risk of conflict and the need for the West to understand the motivations and strategies of Russia and China. He highlights the importance of taking the warnings from these leaders seriously and preparing for a long-term competition for global influence. The Camp David Principles, a new trilateral partnership between the US, Japan, and South Korea, is presented as a response to this challenge, demonstrating a united front against China and North Korea. Ultimately, Sciutto paints a picture of a world on the brink, where old divisions are hardening and new ones are emerging, increasing the potential for a major global conflict. Chapter 3, Flashpoint Baltic Sea. Jim Sciutto's account details a tense encounter between NATO forces and Russia in the Baltic Sea, revealing a dramatically changed security landscape. The chapter highlights how frequent close calls are becoming the new normal, increasing the risk of accidental escalation. The Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, VJTF, led by a German frigate, was conducting exercises when it received warnings of approaching Russian jets and warships near Kaliningrad, a Russian territory separated from the mainland. This area is strategically important to Russia, housing advanced weapons systems like anti-ship missiles and potentially hypersonic missiles, making the Baltic Sea a dangerous zone. Sciutto explains that Kaliningrad serves as a forward operating base for Russia, allowing it to monitor NATO and project power into the region. NATO's increased presence is a direct response to this, aiming to assert its own control over the strategically vital waters. Rear Admiral Thorsten Marx, the VJTF commander, emphasizes the shift in operations compared to the Mediterranean, where the presence of Kaliningrad creates a unique challenge. He draws a parallel to a hypothetical situation where Russia had a territory between Massachusetts and New York, equipped with a naval base and missiles capable of hitting U.S. targets. This illustrates the potential threat Russia poses so close to NATO's borders. The chapter delves into the deteriorating communication between Russia and NATO, a worrying trend. While there were periods of cooperation after the Cold War, contacts aimed at preventing miscalculations have dwindled. Russia now conducts military exercises without notice, and the vocabulary used by Russian officials makes constructive dialogue difficult, according to Marx. This lack of communication increases the risk of misunderstandings and accidental conflict. Sciutto notes that the invasion of Ukraine has exposed flaws in Western assumptions about Putin's rationality, reinforcing the need for clear communication of NATO's commitments. Sciutto also touches upon the historical weight influencing current decisions. Germany, burdened by its past, is cautiously rearming and taking a more assertive role in NATO. Marx reflects on the lessons of World War I and II, expressing a shared European fear of repeating those conflicts. The chapter details a simulated air defense exercise, ADEX, where NATO ships practice defending against attacks mirroring Russian tactics. This exercise quickly transitioned from simulation to real-world vigilance when actual Russian aircraft approached. The crew activated multiple layers of defense, from missiles to chaff and close-in weapon systems, demonstrating their readiness. The narrative highlights the differing rules of engagement between NATO and Russia. NATO forces maintain a greater distance and operate with transparency, while Russian pilots often disregard these norms, engaging in aggressive maneuvers. This disparity creates a dangerous dynamic, as illustrated by incidents like the harassment of a U.S. drone over the Black Sea and attempts to provoke U.S. fighter jets over Syria. Sciutto recounts stories from NATO pilots about increasingly risky encounters with Russian aircraft, emphasizing the heightened tension. While the immediate encounter with the Russian aircraft ended without incident, the chapter underscores the broader strategic implications. NATO is increasing its readiness and deploying more forces to the Baltic Sea, signaling its resolve. Mark stresses that the alliance is not underestimating Russia's capabilities, despite its setbacks in Ukraine. He points out Russia's ability to quickly mobilize resources and adapt, warning against complacency. The VJTF's mission is to be a visible deterrent, ready to respond to any threat within hours. Sciutto introduces the growing concern about Russia's targeting of critical infrastructure, including undersea cables and pipelines. He notes Russia's history of deploying ships with underwater capabilities near these vital links, raising fears of sabotage. The Ukraine war has demonstrated Russia's willingness to target civilian infrastructure, leading NATO to prepare for the possibility of similar attacks in Europe. The chapter also hints at the emerging threat from China in this domain, a topic Sciutto explores further in later chapters. The chapter concludes with a sobering assessment of the challenges facing NATO. Germany, despite its renewed commitment to defense, struggles with recruitment and maintaining a modern military. Sciutto notes the lack of public enthusiasm for military service among younger generations and the need to rebuild the country's defense industry. While NATO is adapting and increasing its readiness, the alliance faces significant hurdles in preparing for a potential conflict with Russia. The Estonian defense officials comment that Russia put Europe to sleep and is now struggling to wake up, encapsulates the sense of urgency and the need for a fundamental shift in mindset. Chapter 4: Russia's Next Targets. Jim Sciutto's reporting focuses on the growing danger from Russia and how countries like Estonia are preparing for a possible attack. Estonia, a small country bordering Russia, is seen by NATO as a kind of early warning system. If Russia were to attack Estonia, it would be a direct challenge to NATO and a sign of much bigger problems. Estonian leaders have been warning for years that they could be Russia's next target, pointing to history and Russia's current actions. They aren't being dramatic. They're simply stating what they believe is a very real possibility. Sciutto details a meeting with Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, who recently won re-election, promising to increase defense spending. Kallas believes that defending Ukraine is essential to defending Estonia. She argues that Russia doesn't respect the independence of countries like Estonia and sees them as rightfully belonging within its sphere of influence. She feels that Western European countries don't fully understand the seriousness of the threat because they haven't faced the same dangers. Kallas is asking her citizens to pay more taxes to fund the military, something not often seen in times of war, showing how seriously she takes the situation. She points out that Western Europe enjoyed decades of peace without needing to worry about a powerful, aggressive neighbor. The chapter highlights a key disagreement within NATO. Eastern European countries, like Estonia, see Russia as an immediate and existential threat, while Western European countries often view the situation with more distance. Kallas criticizes the idea of tripwire defense, where NATO would allow Russia to initially overrun Estonia before attempting to push them back. She argues this would mean the destruction of her country and its culture. She successfully pushed for a change in NATO's defense plans, moving from a strategy of deterrence to one of defense, meaning a quicker and more robust response to any attack. This involved pre-positioning military equipment and establishing a quick reaction force ready to deploy rapidly. Sciutto explains the historical context, noting Estonia's short period of independence since the fall of the Soviet Union. He emphasizes the geographical reality. Russia is very close to NATO countries. Tallinn, Estonia's capital, is only a short distance from St. Petersburg, Russia. The presence of a large Russian-speaking population within Estonia also creates vulnerabilities, as these communities might be less supportive of NATO forces. NATO service members visiting Estonia are advised to take precautions, like using secure communication and avoiding the border with Russia, due to the risk of espionage and even kidnapping. Callas draws parallels between the current situation and historical events, like the appeasement of Hitler before World War II. She fears that Western leaders might be tempted to make concessions to Russia, sacrificing smaller countries like Estonia in the process. She believes Russia's actions demonstrate a pattern of aggression that won't stop unless it's met with strong resistance. She points to Russia's past actions, including the annexation of Crimea in 2014, as evidence of this pattern. The chapter broadens the scope to include Moldova, another former Soviet republic that is vulnerable to Russian aggression. Russia attempted to destabilize Moldova through a plot to overthrow its government, similar to tactics used in Ukraine. While NATO supports Moldova, it is not a member of the alliance, making it more susceptible to Russian interference. Sciutto notes that Russia consistently denies any wrongdoing, blaming the West for attempting to interfere in its sphere of influence. Sciutto concludes by emphasizing the importance of learning from history and the need for NATO to be prepared for a long-term confrontation with Russia. Callas stresses that Russia's aggression is not a temporary issue, but a fundamental challenge to the international order. She believes that NATO needs to move beyond simply talking about defense and actually invest in the forces and equipment necessary to deter Russia. She also points out a shift in power within NATO, with countries closer to Russia taking a more leading role in advocating for stronger defenses. Ultimately, Sciutto's reporting paints a picture of a dangerous and unpredictable situation, where the threat of war is very real and requires constant vigilance. Chapter 5, Target Taiwan. Jim Sciutto's fifth chapter dives deep into the growing tensions surrounding Taiwan, framing it as a potential flashpoint for a future conflict, drawing significant parallels to the ongoing war in Ukraine and the strategies of both Russia and China. The chapter begins with a visit to Penghu, a Taiwanese-controlled island group strategically positioned close to the Chinese coast, where Taiwanese soldiers are constantly preparing for a possible invasion. Sciutto emphasizes the urgency of their training, noting that they practice responding to simulated attacks within minutes, a necessity given the short distance to mainland China. He highlights the Taiwanese military's adoption of combined arms operations, coordinating different military branches, a tactic proving successful for Ukraine while Russia struggles with it. Sciutto quickly connects the situation in Taiwan to the lessons learned from Ukraine. Taiwanese forces are now focusing on countering drones, organizing into smaller, more mobile units, and strengthening their air defenses, all mirroring strategies employed by Ukraine to resist the Russian invasion. Colonel Chang, a Taiwanese military leader, believes that the key to Taiwan's defense lies in the high morale and willingness to fight of its soldiers, a quality he believes Russian forces lacked in Ukraine. This echoes a central theme of the war in Ukraine, the power of a motivated defense force fighting to protect its homeland. However, Sciutto notes a stark contrast between the military's preparedness and the general attitude in Taiwan's capital, Taipei. He describes a sense of calm, even skepticism, about the threat of invasion, comparing it to a similar feeling he observed in Beirut, a city accustomed to the possibility of conflict. While government officials publicly warn of Chinese aggression, many Taiwanese citizens seem to downplay the risks, believing that decades of threats haven't resulted in action. This disconnect between official warnings and public perception is a crucial point, highlighting the challenge of preparing a population for a potential war they may not believe is coming. The chapter then shifts to a discussion of China's military planning, revealing a common saying within Taiwan: "If you want to take Taiwan, you have to take Penghu first." This underscores the strategic importance of the Penghu Islands as a forward military base and a likely initial target in any invasion scenario. Sciutto details the increasing frequency of Chinese military incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, noting that these actions are not just about testing defenses, but also sending a message to both Taiwan and the United States, particularly after high-profile visits like that of Nancy Pelosi. Sciutto emphasizes that China's actions are being closely watched by Taiwan and the U.S., and that the lessons from Ukraine are being actively incorporated into Taiwan's defense strategy. The concept of a porcupine defense is introduced, the idea of making Taiwan so difficult to invade that China would deem the cost too high. This involves focusing on asymmetrical warfare, equipping Taiwan with weapons that can inflict significant damage on a larger, more powerful invading force, like anti-ship missiles and drones. Admiral Lee, a former chief of Taiwan's general staff, stresses the need for this shift in focus, arguing that Taiwan needs more mobile, distributed weapon systems. The author points out a worrying trend, a breakdown in communication between Taiwan and China. Officials report that attempts to contact their Chinese counterparts often go unanswered, even during emergencies. This lack of dialogue increases the risk of miscalculation and escalation, particularly in the sensitive area of military encounters. Sciutto highlights a near-miss incident in the Taiwan Strait involving a U.S. warship and a Chinese destroyer, illustrating the dangers of operating in close proximity without clear communication channels. Sciutto also explores the possibility that China might pursue a strategy short of a full-scale invasion, a boa constrictor scenario, as described by Congressman Auchincloss. This involves using economic pressure, cyber attacks, and disinformation campaigns to gradually weaken Taiwan and force it to accept reunification on China's terms. This strategy, Sciutto suggests, could be more likely than a direct military assault, as it avoids the risks of a war with the United States. The chapter concludes with a sense of unease, emphasizing the high stakes and the potential for conflict, while also acknowledging the resilience and determination of the Taiwanese people to defend their island. Chapter 6: Taiwan's Existential Questions. Jim Sciutto's chapter dives deep into the very real possibility of a war involving Taiwan, drawing strong connections to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the behaviors of leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. The central question isn't simply if China will invade Taiwan, but a series of more complex questions about Xi Jinping's motivations and calculations. Sciutto explains that understanding Xi is key, as China has become increasingly focused on the ambitions of one man rather than a collective leadership. This is a shift from previous Chinese leadership, and it's making the situation more unpredictable. Sciutto illustrates this point by comparing Xi Jinping to Putin. Both leaders came up through similar communist systems, which prioritize the leader's survival and discourage disagreement. He notes that Putin seemed to believe his own narrative about Ukraine, ignoring warnings from his advisors, and there's a concern that Xi is similarly surrounded by yes-men, leading him to overestimate China's ability to successfully invade Taiwan. A Taiwanese colonel, Chiang Kai-ming, shared this view, pointing out the similarities in their leadership styles and the dangers of a leader operating in an echo chamber. The chapter highlights a growing sense of pessimism in Taiwan itself. Deputy Minister Jan Jihorng believes the situation has worsened under Xi, contrasting his leadership with that of his predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, who were seen as more predictable. Jan explains that previous leaders were more open to information and communication, even through unofficial channels. Now, those channels are drying up, and it's unclear if even well-intentioned messages are reaching Xi. This is compounded by a change in China's internal dynamics. It's becoming a one-man state where Xi's decisions are paramount and dissent is suppressed. Sciutto uses the example of China's strict zero-COVID policy and its actions in Hong Kong and Xinjiang to demonstrate Xi's willingness to take drastic measures, even at a significant cost. Sciutto points out a surprising parallel: China's willingness to economically punish Australia for speaking out against its policies. Despite the economic damage to both countries, Xi prioritized political control. This suggests that economic considerations may not be as strong a deterrent as some believe. This is a crucial point, as many observers previously assumed that the economic consequences of invading Taiwan would be too high for China to bear. The chapter also explores the lessons China might be drawing from Russia's experience in Ukraine. While Russia's struggles may give Xi pause, there's also a fear that it could accelerate his timeline. Sciutto quotes CIA Director Bill Burns, who suggests that Xi might believe his window of opportunity is closing, prompting him to act sooner rather than later. The author notes that the U.S. intelligence community believes Xi has tasked the People's Liberation Army with developing the capability to invade Taiwan by 2027. Sciutto emphasizes the importance of deterrence and the hope that the international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine will discourage China. However, he also acknowledges skepticism from Taiwanese officials, who believe they must rely on their own defense capabilities. They point to the need for a strong national identity and a unified will to resist. The chapter also touches on the question of whether the U.S. would actually defend Taiwan, noting President Biden's repeated statements that it would, despite official U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity. Sciutto highlights the concerns of former officials like John Kelly, who argue that the American public needs to have a serious conversation about the potential costs of such a conflict. Ultimately, Sciutto's chapter paints a picture of a highly volatile situation. The fate of Taiwan may rest on the decisions of a single leader, Xi Jinping, and his willingness to take risks. The chapter suggests that understanding his motivations, learning from the lessons of Ukraine, and preparing for the worst are crucial steps in preventing a catastrophic war. The author concludes that Taiwan is attempting a delicate balancing act, projecting strength and determination while hoping to dissuade Xi from taking action. A trick to make him believe an invasion would not succeed. Chapter 7, No Longer Unthinkable. Jim Sciutto details a period of intense worry in the summer and fall of 2022, when U.S. officials began to seriously consider the possibility of Russia using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. This wasn't just a far-off fear. It was based on intelligence showing Russia was preparing for such a step as its military faced setbacks on the battlefield, particularly around the city of Kherson. The concern stemmed from Russia's military rules, which allow for nuclear weapon use if Russia itself or its controlled territory feels threatened. Losing Kherson, a significant occupied city, could have been seen as such a threat. The Biden administration began preparing rigorously for the unthinkable planning responses in case Russia actually used a nuclear weapon. Other European countries shared these concerns and also started making preparations. The situation was made even more unsettling by Russia's attempts to spread false information, claiming Ukraine was preparing to use a dirty bomb, a conventional explosive with radioactive material. U.S. officials believed this was a smokescreen, either to justify a Russian nuclear attack or to cover up Russia preparing one itself. Adding to the worry, intelligence indicated that Russian officials were discussing the possibility of a nuclear strike internally. While the U.S. hadn't seen evidence of Russia moving nuclear weapons into position, the possibility remained that a smaller, tactical nuclear weapon could be used without the U.S. knowing in advance. Sciutto explains that Russia's view of nuclear weapons differs from that of the West. While the U.S. and other countries have moved away from a policy of never using nuclear weapons first, Russia has maintained a more flexible approach, suggesting it might use them even in a conventional war if its existence is threatened. This, combined with the weakening Russian military position in Ukraine, raised the stakes considerably. The author highlights that Russia's actions were not just about Ukraine. They were about sending a message to the West and potentially reshaping the global balance of power. To deter Russia, the U.S. and its allies engaged in intense diplomatic efforts, directly warning Russian officials of severe consequences if a nuclear weapon were used. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Mark Milley both spoke directly with their Russian counterparts, emphasizing the seriousness of the situation. The US also worked to rally international support, reaching out to countries like China and India, hoping they would use their influence with Russia to discourage a nuclear strike. Sciutto notes that the US believed China and India had a shared interest in preventing nuclear escalation. However, the situation was complicated by the breakdown of arms control treaties between the US and Russia. Treaties that once limited the number of nuclear weapons and allowed for inspections were either abandoned or suspended, leading to less transparency and increased uncertainty. This lack of rules, combined with the expansion of nuclear arsenals by countries like China and North Korea, created a more dangerous environment. Russia's decision to suspend its participation in the New START Treaty in February 2023, as detailed by Sciutto, further worsened the situation. Sciutto points out that some officials believe the West may be overreacting to Russia's nuclear threats, potentially giving Russia more leverage. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas argued that the West should not be afraid to hold Russia accountable, as Russia's threats are aimed at scaring Western nations. The author concludes that the world is entering a new era of nuclear danger, where the unthinkable is once again a possibility, and the old rules no longer apply. The breakdown of international agreements and the rise of new nuclear powers create a volatile situation that requires careful management and a firm response to any escalation. Chapter 8: A Multifront War. Jim Sciutto details a world increasingly divided, with the United States facing challenges from both Russia and China on multiple fronts. The chapter opens with a startling event: a Chinese high-altitude balloon flying over the United States in early 2023. This wasn't just a balloon. It was a symbol of a new kind of competition happening in near space, the area 60,000 feet above the Earth. Sciutto explains that even small incidents can quickly escalate tensions between powerful countries, and this balloon incident was a prime example. The United States tracked the balloon for days and initially downplayed the threat, stating it posed no danger to people on the ground. However, public outcry, especially from Republicans, grew as the balloon drifted over Montana, home to important U.S. nuclear missile sites. The debate highlighted a key issue: how to respond to a potential threat without triggering a larger conflict. Ultimately, President Biden ordered the military to wait until the balloon was over the ocean before shooting it down, minimizing risk to people below. Sciutto notes that while the balloon's surveillance capabilities were initially described as limited, assessments changed multiple times, demonstrating the difficulty in understanding the true nature of the threat. The eventual downing of the balloon, televised like a strange fireworks display, didn't end the story. China protested, warning the U.S. not to repeat such actions, and state-controlled media hinted at retaliation. Sciutto emphasizes that the balloon incident revealed a larger challenge: China's aggressive intelligence gathering. He quotes intelligence officials who describe China's efforts as massive and relentless, unlike anything seen from other nations. While the U.S. and its allies focus on collecting specific, crucial information, China seems to be vacuuming up everything it can. This is a significant concern, as it gives China a broader understanding of U.S. systems and vulnerabilities. The author points out that the U.S. has had some success in penetrating Russian intelligence networks, even gaining access to high levels of the Kremlin, and in understanding Chinese thinking, but the sheer scale of China's efforts is daunting. Beyond near space, Sciutto turns to the Arctic, where Russia is strengthening its military presence. Despite the war in Ukraine, Russia's navy remains a powerful force, and the Arctic is a key area for Russia to demonstrate its strength, particularly with its nuclear submarines. Russia is testing new, advanced weapons, like the Poseidon torpedo, a nuclear-powered weapon designed to evade U.S. defenses. While the U.S. has limited capabilities in the Arctic compared to Russia, the author highlights the strategic importance of the region. China's role in the Arctic is currently less prominent, and Russia has signaled it won't extend its no-limits partnership with China to this region. Sciutto then steps back to assess the broader intelligence landscape. He notes that the US and its allies are facing an unprecedented number of adversaries with increasingly sophisticated capabilities. While China presents the biggest long-term challenge, the US has had some recent successes against Russia, including predicting its invasion of Ukraine and disrupting its intelligence operations. However, the author stresses that the US can't beat China at its own game. The scale of China's resources is simply too vast. He highlights the importance of human intelligence, or HUMINT, and notes the CIA's recent efforts to recruit sources within Russia. The chapter includes a vivid account of a US surveillance flight over the South China Sea, illustrating the risks of operating near Chinese territory. The author recounts how Chinese naval forces repeatedly warned the US aircraft to leave the area, demonstrating the potential for escalation. Sciutto recalls a past incident where a Chinese fighter jet collided with a US surveillance plane, highlighting the dangers of these encounters. The US response to the balloon incident, shooting down 3 more unidentified objects over North America, was criticized as overreaction. Sciutto explains that the US military adjusted its sensors to detect slower-moving objects, leading to a surge in detections. While officials maintained these objects didn't pose an immediate threat, the events fueled public anxiety and political debate. The author details how the US and China exchanged accusations, with China claiming the US had conducted similar surveillance flights over its territory. Sciutto concludes by emphasizing the importance of communication and understanding between the great powers. He notes that the US and China appeared to be de-escalating tensions after the balloon incident, with both sides showing a willingness to avoid further conflict. However, Russia continues to escalate its military activities in the Arctic, testing new weapons and demonstrating its power. The author points to the need for continued dialogue and a clear understanding of each other's intentions to prevent miscalculation and avoid a larger conflict. He ends by foreshadowing the potential impact of Donald Trump's return to power on this delicate geopolitical landscape. Chapter 9, Trump Wildcard. Jim Sciutto paints a concerning picture of what a second Donald Trump presidency could mean for the United States and the world, especially when it comes to Russia, China, and the possibility of war. The author highlights a deep worry among former Trump administration officials, like retired Marine General John Kelly, who believe another 4 years of Trump would be a disaster. Kelly, who served closely with Trump, describes a leader driven by self-interest and lacking a strong understanding of global issues. This isn't just one person's opinion. Sciutto notes that officials from the US and other countries share this fear. A central concern is Trump's unusual admiration for authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin of Russia and Xi Jinping of China. Sciutto explains that Trump seems to value personal relationships with these leaders above all else, believing that if he gets along with them, the US will automatically have good relations with their countries. This is a flawed idea, as the interests of the US and these nations often clash. For example, Trump once seemed to side with Putin during a discussion about Russian interference in the 2016 US election, raising questions about his loyalty to America. He also praised Xi Jinping's leadership, even while overlooking human rights abuses against the Uyghur people in China. Sciutto details disturbing accounts of Trump's views, including claims that he expressed admiration for Adolf Hitler, focusing on Hitler's economic policies and his ability to maintain loyalty from his staff. This is deeply troubling, as it shows a lack of understanding of the horrors of the Holocaust and the dangers of unchecked power. The author emphasizes that Trump doesn't seem to recognize the fundamental difference between democratic and autocratic governments, viewing them all as simply powerful leaders. This could lead to a dramatic shift in US foreign policy, potentially siding with dictatorships instead of supporting democracies. The author points out Trump's impulsive nature and lack of a clear strategy as major risks. Sciutto recounts instances where Trump nearly withdrew the US from NATO, a crucial military alliance, simply because he questioned its value. He also considered shooting down an Iranian missile, an act that could have easily led to war. These actions demonstrate a willingness to take drastic steps without fully considering the consequences. Sciutto explains that Trump often operates based on gut feelings and a desire to appear tough, rather than on careful analysis and expert advice. Sciutto also highlights the potential for Russia to interfere in the 2024 U.S. election, hoping to see Trump return to power. U.S. intelligence agencies have already concluded that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to help Trump, and there are concerns they might do so again. The author notes that Putin may believe a second Trump presidency would be more favorable to Russia's interests, especially regarding the war in Ukraine. Domestically, Sciutto warns that false claims about election fraud, fueled by Trump and his supporters, could undermine trust in the democratic process and create chaos. The author concludes that the challenges facing the U.S. are bigger than any one election or leader. China and Russia are both challenging the U.S.-led international order, and the world is becoming increasingly divided. Sciutto suggests that a return to isolationism, a policy of avoiding involvement in international affairs, would be a mistake. He emphasizes the need for strong U.S. leadership and a commitment to defending democratic values in the face of growing global threats. The chapter serves as a warning about the potential dangers of a second Trump presidency and the importance of understanding the complex geopolitical landscape. Chapter 10, Paths to Peace. Jim Sciutto's chapter dives into the scary possibility of another big war, looking at how things have changed since the Cold War and what lessons leaders can learn from history. He starts by reminding us of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world was on the edge of nuclear war. President Kennedy read a book about how World War I started and realized it was a mess of misunderstandings and pride. He was determined not to make the same mistakes. Sciutto points out that today's world feels similar, with rising tensions between powerful countries like the United States, Russia, and China. The author explains that just like in 1914 and 1962, there are a lot of things that could accidentally lead to war. There are new alliances forming, like NATO getting stronger and new groups like AUKUS, but also partnerships between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Plus, the war in Ukraine is making everyone nervous and increasing military spending. Sciutto shares a conversation with the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, who said countries are playing without a net, meaning there aren't enough rules or ways to talk to each other to prevent a disaster. There aren't many agreements about how to behave in new areas of conflict, like cyberspace and space. Sciutto highlights that the situation is different from the Cold War. Back then, the US and the Soviet Union were the main players. Now, China is a major economic and military power, and Russia is still dangerous despite economic problems. The author notes that while neither China nor Russia want a full-scale war with the US, they are both willing to compete for influence. He emphasizes that a war involving nuclear weapons would be devastating for everyone. The chapter then looks at what can be done to avoid war. Sciutto interviews leaders from around the world and finds a common theme: learning from the past. Kennedy's approach during the Cuban Missile Crisis is a good example. He didn't immediately attack Cuba, even when a U-2 spy plane was shot down. He also used secret communication channels to negotiate with the Soviet Union. The result was a deal where Russia removed missiles from Cuba, and the US removed missiles from Turkey. Sciutto explains that today's leaders need to find a balance between being strong and talking to each other. They need to understand each other's limits and find areas where they can cooperate, like fighting climate change. He points to Kevin Rudd's ideas about setting clear rules for competition and avoiding accidental escalation, especially regarding Taiwan. The author shares insights from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who believes the US-China relationship is different from the US-Soviet relationship because of how much the two countries' economies are linked. The chapter also discusses the situation in Ukraine. Western leaders agree that Russia cannot be allowed to win, as that would encourage other countries to use force. Sciutto notes a debate among allies about how far Ukraine should push to reclaim territory, and whether a land for peace deal might be necessary. He also highlights the importance of deterring China from invading Taiwan, suggesting a strategy of making it clear to China that an invasion would be too costly. Sciutto emphasizes the need for stronger defenses in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, where countries feel threatened by Russia. He also stresses the importance of arms control agreements, especially regarding nuclear weapons. He points out that the US, Russia, and China need to talk to each other about limiting their nuclear arsenals, and that new rules are needed for weapons in cyberspace and space. Finally, Sciutto argues that the US needs to strengthen its economy and build alliances to compete with Russia and China. He believes that domestic unity is crucial, and that the US needs to avoid the mistakes of the past by supporting a strong international order. He concludes that avoiding war requires clear principles, strong power, and a willingness to cooperate, even with rivals. The author suggests a strategy of constrainment for China, which is more nuanced than simple containment, recognizing the interconnectedness of the global economy. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.